Welcome back. We are going to continue in the nervous system and we're going to be looking at now the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is going to have a few different functions in terms of the nervous system. Let's remember for a second that the nervous system has a one-way flow of information. So remember that we have those three overlapping functions. So we've got sensory information coming in, integration happening in the central nervous system, so brain and spinal cord, and then motor information going out. Okay, so that's our flow of information through here. So in terms of the function, the first would be to conduct these signals to and from the brain. So if a sensory information comes in down here, it's going to travel up the cord to the brain. Motor information is going to start up in the brain and it's going to travel down the cord and out at a certain spinal nerve and go to whatever it's going to go deal with. We've got integration components because it is part of the central nervous system. So we've got multiple different inputs coming in that are integrated and routed to a specific part of the brain using the integration in the spinal cord. We've got some locomotion, some movement that's involved here, particularly repetitive movements, things like walking. And then we have spinal reflexes that we'll talk about, which are very fast-acting, stereotyped responses to a specific stimulus. So a few different things going on here. So let's talk about the anatomy here. So first of all, your spinal cord begins at the foramen magnum. So you should remember that's the pretty large hole in the occipital bone. And so that's where we're going to start this. And the cord comes down and terminates at what's called the conus medullaris or medullary cone. And this is roughly at about L1 vertebrae. So your spinal cord certainly does not go all the way down. It is going to end at about L1. And then you've got what's called the cauda equina below that. So cauda equina means tail of a horse. And if you've ever seen a horse's tail, there's kind of this little nub, and then there's all the hair that comes off of it. So the conus medullaris is the end of the actual cord, but there's all of the spinal nerves hanging down off of it that have to exit lower than L1. So you've got this structure that kind of resembles a horse's tail here. Now, coming off of the conus medullaris is going to be a small connective tissue fiber that's going to come down and connect here to what's called the pia mater. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then there's a piece of connective tissue that comes off of that that's going to come down. It's called the filum terminale that is going to anchor onto the coccyx. So this is going to keep the spinal cord from sort of swaying back and forth in the vertebral column. So we divide it into four regions. We have a cervical region, a thoracic region, a lumbar region, and then a sacrococcygeal region. There are two different enlargements. So we've got a cervical enlargement where we have, excuse me, a few extra nerves coming out for the brachial plexus, so the cord gets a little bit wider there in diameter. And then same thing down in the lumbar region where we've got a lot of nerves coming out that innervate the legs. We're going to see a little bit wider of a cord there. Now the cord is not very wide. If you look at your thumb, that's roughly the width of the cord at the widest part. So people tend to think that it's a cord, like it's really heavy duty. It's very small, okay? If you think back to the vertebrae that you guys looked at in lab and think about the size of the vertebral foramen, it's not a huge giant hole. And so the spinal cord has to fit through there along with all of the connective tissue that's around it. So it's actually really, really quite small. Originating off of the spinal cord are 31 different paired spinal nerves. So they're all going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. So let's talk about the protections here. I mentioned the pia. The pia mater is part of what's called the meninges. So the meninges are going to protect the entire central nervous system. So we're talking about, we're going to see this in the brain, and then it continues down around the spinal cord. Within the meninges are where we're going to find another protection for the CNS, which is cerebrospinal fluid. So when we look at the meninges, we have three different layers. The outermost layer, which is represented here by this kind of deep orangish rust color, is called the dura mater. Okay. And then you're going to have the arachnoid mater, which is in blue. And then you have what's called the subarachnoid space. That's where you find your cerebrospinal fluid. So this is all subarachnoid space in here. And then the pia mater is actually this pink color that is running along the surface of the cord, and anywhere that the cord sort of folds in, the pia mater comes with it. The pia is surrounding blood vessels, things like that, that are supplying the central nervous system. So the pia mater is very, very delicate. The arachnoid mater has all of these kind of projections that are spider web-like that move down into the subarachnoid space. That's where it gets its name. And then the dura mater is very tough. Literally, it translates to tough mother in Latin. So it is very heavy-duty connective tissue designed to be protective for this incredibly delicate tissue in it. Now, in the spinal cord, we have an additional space called the epidural space right here. This is not found in the brain. So when we get to the brain, we're not going to see an epidural space. We only have an epidural space around the spinal cord. So let's talk about these. The epidural space is basically a whole bunch of fat and blood vessels, and it sits kind of cushions between the space between the spinal cord and the vertebrae. We obviously wouldn't want the spinal cord sort of smashing into bone. Okay, it's pretty delicate, so we fill that space up with fat. So we utilize this space to administer spinal anesthetics, or what are known as epidurals. So you can see this is how we get into the space here. So when you give an epidural, you are not going through the dura. You are outside of the dura. So epidural means above the dura. So when we administer an epidural, we are not actually puncturing the meninges. We also use the CSF in a clinical setting that's found in the subarachnoid space. This is how we're going to do what are called lumbar punctures or lumbar taps. So the way we do this is the dura, okay, so here's our dura out here, and the arachnoid mater extend well past the conus medullaris. And so this subarachnoid space is filled up with all our cerebrospinal fluid. So we can actually sample that fluid by inserting a needle into the subarachnoid space. Now remember there, we have to go through the dura and we have to go through the arachnoid mater into the subarachnoid space, but we don't do it up here where the cord is. We go below the level of the conus medullaris. So remember, this is like L1 right here. So we have quite a bit of space down in the lumbar area where you've got the CSF, but you're not dealing with possibly injuring your cord. So this is useful in diagnosing things like meningitis or other infections. So difference between them is an epidural, you are not puncturing the dura or the arachnoid. You are outside of the meninges, whereas a lumbar puncture is going to be a lot more invasive and you're going to move in through the meninges to get to the CSF. So a couple different clinically important components there. All right, let's talk cross-sectional here. So again, let's take a second, look at our meninges. So here's our dura, here's our arachnoid, here's our pia. So between these two, we would have our subarachnoid space with our CSF. All right, so cross-sectional. We can see that we call it sort of like a butterfly. There's like a butterfly shape of gray matter that is deep, with white matter being superficial around it. You have a central canal. We're going to find out later that this is connected to all the ventricles in your brain. And then your spinal nerves are going to associate with both the dorsal and the ventral side of the cord here using these little rootlets. Okay. So, first thing to note is that the dorsal side of the cord is sensory. The ventral side is motor. That is a hard, fast rule. So if we take this spinal nerve over here, we're going to have information coming in. And we know that information coming in is always sensory, that one-way flow. The sensory information comes in and goes into the cord on the dorsal side. Integration happens. The motor information originates on the ventral side and goes back out and into the nerve. There is a one-way flow of information through here. So sensory comes in on the dorsal, motor goes out on the ventral. We're going to talk about the gray matter now. Okay, so this is the deep component of the spinal cord. And you should be thinking, okay, I know what gray matter is. This is where I'm going to find dendrites. It's where I'm going to find cell bodies and any unmyelinated axons. Because we talked about the difference between gray and white. So if we look at a map here of the gray matter, here's our gray matter, we are going to find out that it is very specific as to what cell bodies are found where. It is not a random jumbled up mix of sensory and motor. I just told you that the dorsal side is sensory and the ventral side is motor. So you can already begin to say, okay, well, sensory must be on this side and motor must be on this side. So the dorsal horns. We're going to divide our gray matter into what are called horns. So here's our dorsal horns here. They are receiving input from somatic, remember that word means basic, and visceral, that word means organs, sensory information. So let's look at this, the green and the blue. Blue is coming from a basic structure like your skin. Green is coming from an organ like your stomach. That information comes in on unipolar neurons. So going back to our classes of neurons. So there's their little cell bodies, okay, in what's called the dorsal root ganglion. And you should remember that a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. Here's the central nervous system. This is outside of it. This is a ganglion. So this information comes in. So you got information coming in from your skin, information coming in from your stomach. And it's all going to come in on the dorsal side. What are we going to have in the gray matter? We're going to have synapses. This is where the axons of your sensory neurons meet up with the cell bodies of your interneurons. That's another type of neuron that we talked about. It is multipolar in structure. So when we look at the dorsal horn, we're going to find that most dorsal is going to be all of the interneuron cell bodies that deal with the somatic sensory. And then if you go a little bit more ventral, but still in the dorsal horn, you're going to get the cell bodies of the interneurons that deal with the visceral sensory information. So the dorsal horn is a bunch of synapses between sensory neurons and interneurons. And of course, everything is sensory. Integration is dealing in those interneurons here. So that's part of their process. The ventral horns. This is where we're going to find the cell bodies of the motor neurons. So the ventral horn itself here is going to have these red neurons. So these are somatic motor neurons. They're going out to our somatic structures, so skeletal muscles, your skin, sweat glands, things like that. So the motor plan is going to end up synapsing here. Again, what do we have here? Synapses. And that cell body is then going to attach to its axon, and it's going to head out on the ventral side of the cord because it's motor. Now, in two places in the thoracic and lumbar regions, we also have what's called a lateral horn. Here you're going to find the cell bodies of visceral motor neurons. So these are the motor neurons that are going to exist in the autonomic nervous system, and they're going to go to your organs. So there is nothing random about the placement of these. Dorsal is always sensory. Ventral is always motor. Now let's talk white matter. That's going to be superficial in the cord. The white matter is going to be divided into what are called tracts. So we have ascending tracts in red here. It is important to know that all of these tracts are also on the other side. This would all be red. They have just separated it so that you can see ascending versus descending. Ascending tracts are taking information up the cord toward the brain. Descending tracts are taking information from the brain down to a motor output. So anything that's in an ascending is going up. Anything that's in a descending is going down. What is in white matter? Myelinated axons. So these are where the axons are traveling up through the cord. The gray matter is all about the cell bodies and the synapses. The white matter, which are divided into what are called tracts that are found in what are called funiculi, they are all dealing with the axons. So we have a dorsal funiculus, a lateral funiculus, and then a ventral funiculus. So within them are the ascending and descending tracts. Now, again, there is basically maps of your body within each of these tracts because location matters. So how we know that a piece of sensory information is coming in from our arm versus our leg has to do with where the information comes up in these tracks. So location is really important. How we know that a certain motor output is going to end up in our hands instead of our feet is going to be dictated by where it comes down in these tracks. So let's kind of put this together here. Here we have receptors for something somatic. So pain, heat, and cold. So this is coming from our skin. We have what's called a first order neuron. It started back in the skin. It was activated, and we set off an action potential, and the action potential is going to come in. It's on a unipolar neuron, because that's what basic sensory neurons are. The cell body is in the dorsal root ganglia. The axon comes in and synapses with an interneuron in the dorsal horn. Now we're going to move into what's called the second order neuron. This is what's going to travel through specific ascending tracts. Now I'm not going to make you learn all the names of all of the tracts, but it's going to come up through a specific portion of a specific track, and then it's going to hit the brain stem, and it's going to come up through the medulla, it's going to come up through the pons, the midbrain, and then it's going to synapse in a structure called the thalamus. There, you're going to get your third order neuron that is going to route to a very specific space in what's called the somatosensory cortex. If this, let's say, came from your hand, okay, it's going to come in, and this neuron is going to synapse with an interneuron that is going to route into the part of this track that codes for hand. And it's going to go up, 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 all the time carrying the information that this came from my hand. Okay? Now, There is a map of your body on this cortex. The thalamus is going to take this information and go, okay, this came from the hand, and it's going to route it into a neuron that directs it to hand. Location is everything here. There is nothing random about it. Now, descending, we start in what's called the motor cortex, and we make a motor plan, and we go through our process, and we start our action potential, and it begins to travel down. Again, it's traveling through the brainstem here, and then when it gets to the cord, oftentimes it's going to switch sides, so that's called decussation here, right there, where it switches. And again, it's traveling down in a very specific track, which is going to lead it to a space that's going to take it to where it's supposed to go. So if this is coding for upper arm, okay, then all of this coming down here through these specific tracks and where it crosses the cord, and then this spinal nerve would lead to upper arm. So everything is very, very specific in the location in both the spinal cord and the brain, which we'll talk about in the next chapter.